So with the announcement of a new update coming to Repentance in the near future, finally, I would like to take this opportunity to have a quick discussion about some of the changes that I personally would like to see and some things that can be improved on. In addition to bug fixes, maybe addressing delirium, kind of the typical stuff that gets brought up a lot when people talk about the current version of the game, I'd also like to discuss a couple of the low-tier Tainted characters and what we can do to make them a little bit more viable, because some of these characters are just appallingly frustrating to play right now, and very badly designed in some ways. Not all of them, but a select few, and it's those select few that I'd like to talk about today. So, without any further ado, let's get into it here. There are three characters in particular I'd like to focus on, and the first of these is going to be Tainted Lazarus. The thing about Tainted Lazarus, as he is right now, is that he is effectively all the downsides of Jacob and Esau, all the downsides of Jacob and Esau, with none of the benefits. And Jacob and Esau are already considered a fairly frustrating character to play as, so Tainted Lazarus is off to a bad start. His life form is criminally weak in terms of raw base stats, which means that you're heavily encouraged to pump most of your upgrades throughout a run into him. You want to be giving him the syringes, you want to be giving him the various stat boosting pills, the tears ups, your luck ups, etc, etc, etc. But ultimately, you still have to play as both characters. There's no way you can dedicate yourself specifically to one half of the Lazarus equation. It's simply not doable. The only real benefit this character has to this build is the fact that he can switch on a dime using his perma-active item and essentially have 2 health bars, but that only goes so far when you're having to constantly divide all of your run upgrades between these two. It means that any interesting synergies go right out the window. You just more or less have to take what you're given. And 50% of the time you're probably going to be miserable, or you end up playing 2 characters who are both half as strong as they should be normally. So it's just a very, very messy idea for a character. I would be inclined to say it fundamentally doesn't work, but there are ways that this character can be improved. The number one thing that I would like to see is I would like to see his life form, so the standard form of Tainted Lazarus before he flips, get some sort of a stat boost, because right now his stats are just criminally low, and it upsets the general kind of algorithm in terms of how this character is meant to grow, because ideally you'd want to be splitting items evenly between the two of them, but that's just not applicable because regular Lazarus, or regular Tainted Lazarus rather, needs these upgrades in order to be functional, and I think that's horribly unfair on this character. So if we could buff the life form, that would be a really good start. The other thing I'd like to see is a reduced cooldown on flip, because 6 rooms is a long time for such a vital ability, and you feel this as early as the first couple of floors. If you get unlucky with where your treasure room spawns, then sometimes you'll end up having to give certain items to a form that maybe you didn't want them to have, or denying particular items to one half of the equation just because you didn't have enough charges to flip. So 9 times out of 10, I never use flip in combat. I save it exclusively for picking up items, because I need to know, hang on, if one half of the Lazuri has, say, Pyromaniac or Host Hat, and I find Ipecac, I want to make sure that Ipecac's going to the one who's immune to explosions. That's not always going to be the case, though. Just because, again, if there are no batteries around, you are constrained by how many charges you can get for flip, and 6 is way too many, I think. So if we lower that to 3, or okay, let's be conservative, let's say 4. Personally, I would prefer 3, but, you know, whatever. Just reducing the downtime between being able to flip would go a long way to making this character more playable. He would still be bad. That's kind of the thing with these low tiers, is that even with improvements, they're probably still going to be bad. I'm not expecting them to be buffed up to, like, Tainted Cain levels. We just kind of want them to be more playable, and I think these 2 changes here would be a really good starting point for Tainted Lazarus to not be the utter dumpster fire that he is right now, because I know I haven't made a tier list video for Repentance yet. I kind of wanted to wait for the updates first. As it stands right now, Tainted Lazarus, absolutely the worst character in the game. No competition. Moving on from Tainted Lazarus, I'd now like to take a look at Tainted Eden. Now, Tainted Eden, again, is another character who I think is just fundamentally flawed, because you cannot build with this character. You cannot have a deliberate strategy or any kind of intentional synergy. There's no point, because you are going to get hit at some point unless you're a complete machine and you just play perfectly the entire time. But even then, that's totally impractical, because every form of damage causes Tainted Eden to re-roll. Using blood donation machines causes him to re-roll. Using curse room doors, doing literally anything causes this character to re-roll, and I think that's horribly unfair. So one buff that I would like to see put into place is having Tainted Eden's re-rolls obey Devil Room rules. So any indirect form of damage that isn't a mistake, so things like blood donation machines, devil beggars, curse rooms, sacrifice rooms, those shouldn't cause him to re-roll. I think that's very, very unfair, and it kind of breaks one of the established rules of Repentance. You know, that was a really good change that came with Repentance, was the idea that sacrificial damage doesn't lower your Devil Room chance. I think that was a really, really good call. Should have been that way in the first place, but, you know, whatever. So applying those rules to Tainted Eden would kind of line him up thematically better with the rest of the game, and it would make him a lot more playable as well. I mean, you can actually use some of the items that you get. Say if you get a bunch of red heart containers, you can then feed them to a blood donation machine and get a shit ton of money from it. So that would help a lot. D4 rerolling, it is D4, isn't it? Yeah, D4 rerolling is kind of bugged in Repentance anyway. I know NyanTuber made a video about this. How it's intended to work is when an item gets rerolled via the D4 effect, so the exact same effect that Tainted Eden operates with, it's intended to reroll from the same pool as the original item. So if you reroll Sacred Heart, it could turn into, say, Spirit Sword or Holy Water. This doesn't always work as advertised, though, and it kind of causes some problems where you pick up items explicitly knowing that, okay, this comes from a good pool, this is from the Secret Room pool, for example, therefore it has a higher chance of rerolling into something good. But if the game takes a shit and something goes wrong, you've effectively built up those expectations for nothing, which is really disheartening. And it also causes problems with the Devil Room pool, because you can reroll into Dead Cat, which will remove all of your heart containers, and then when you reroll Dead Cat, you also lose all of the lives, so it's basically just a punishment. Devil Rooms are totally unviable for Tainted Eden because of this, at least in my opinion. I do not think they are worth going for. So again, that's another constraint that this character has, which is, in my opinion, totally unnecessary. It didn't have to be that way. If we can somehow address the problem with D4 rerolling, then maybe that would help. Alternatively, you could just make it so that if he rolls into a health container, you don't lose the health again after rerolling a second time. Because to be fair, if I'm playing as Tainted Isaac, and I pick up, you know, breakfast or dinner or any of the HP boosters, I can then drop that item without losing the health I gained from it, and it should be the same for Tainted Eden as well. I think it's hideously unfair that he can re-roll into what are effectively pointless items and then lose all the HP gained from them afterwards. I think that's very, very unfair. So, in my opinion, these improvements would take him from being maybe a bottom tier character to a low tier character, which is about the best we're going to get. And finally, I would like to take the time to talk about Tainted Jacob. This is personally my most hated character in the game. I despise Tainted Jacob. I absolutely hate this character. But he is also very bad, and the main reason for that is the punishment for getting caught by Dark Esau is way too high, considering how long you have to deal with his presence for. If he only did damage, then it wouldn't be an issue at all, because, you know, what a stray hit, that doesn't really mean much. But the fact he essentially turns you into the Lost for the duration of a floor is way too much. you can't even spend the time to kill him without avoiding this. And the big problem, then something that I would like to see addressed, is that Dark Esau is not immune to environmental damage. So I have lost multiple runs with this character. When I get to the womb, if Dark Esau brushes up against a red poop, his health drains so fucking fast. And it's unfair because you only have so much control over how Dark Esau moves. A lot of rooms in this game are corridors. There's the infamous Boomfly corridor, which is just death for this character, because if you can't kill the flies quickly enough to open the door, there isn't really much you can do to avoid 5 exploding enemies and Dark Esau all at once. That's just not going to happen. There are standard corridors in the womb, in Gehenna, which are impossible to navigate with this character. Or they're not impossible, but they may as well be. The odds of getting out of there unscathed are incredibly low. So I think a good change for this character would be making him invulnerable to environmental hazards. So no more spike rocks, no more red poops. That would help a lot, because the whole concept of this character is designed around having to avoid Dark Esau, or at least ignore Dark Esau. So we don't just want to get rid of him entirely, we don't want to make him invincible, because that sort of defeats the point. If Dark Esau were completely invincible, then it would almost be too easy, in a sense. Actually, no, I take that back. It would still be a problem. Dark Esau is way too much of a handicap, but if you're adamant on including him, if that's your vision for this character, then we've got to give the player something to work with here, because the fact that, like, look there, he got poisoned by Brownie's toxic bomb. What was I supposed to do about that? If that killed him, that's not my fault. He plowed straight into that fucking thing. And this happens so frequently. I don't think this character really can be salvaged to the extent that Eden and Lazarus can. But I would like to see them try. I would like to see something work in Tainted Jacob's favor. Maybe even a birthright effect could help. I don't know what that birthright effect would necessarily be, but who knows? There's something we can do here at the very least, because the concept's interesting, the execution leaves a lot to be desired. So while I realize this video has been slightly negative, I don't mean this in any way to disparage the current state of the game. It's just frustrating to see content locked behind these characters who are almost unplayable. And I say this from the perspective of, I have a fully completed save file now, so I put the time in to get completion marks with these characters, and some of them were just pure misery, some of them were anti-fun. So being able to improve them and take them into a state where they're a little bit more playable, that's really all I could ask for. The bug fixes, those were going to happen anyway. The boss adjustments, maybe we'll get something. We'll see. But I'm excited. I'm looking forward to seeing what the development team come up with. And hopefully moving forwards we'll be able to have a little bit more of a stable experience. I won't need to play with the debug console enabled constantly. And we'll take it from there. So my tier list video for this game, I'm going to hold off now that we know there's definitely a patch on the horizon. I had started working on it a little bit, but there's no point now because we know we're going to get an update. And hopefully in the near future we'll be able to take a good look at these characters and rank them in a more complete state. So until then, it's been Mark Brightside, take care of yourselves, and I will see you all soon.